Everyday pedagogy for dance education is all about finding a pedagogy that can work for a creative art form within a very explicit teaching framework in a primary school context. The research questions for my case study, upon which this paper is based, are two. How do students respond to dance education in their classroom, and what are the impacts on teachers of implementing dance in the classroom? And this paper considers the above questions in the context of an attempt to create a pedagogic framework for teaching dance, and asks, what pedagogic framework would best support generalist classroom teachers and music teachers to implement dance in their classrooms and be consistent with currently favoured pedagogic approaches? The background to the study is curriculum change happening Australia-wide, where there is pressure from national testing, a back to basics agenda, and an emphasis overall on performativity. This has tended to put pressure even more on the arts and on the place of the arts within education. And despite a lot of talk about creativity, much of that talk is strategic. And in many ways, the teaching of the arts hasn't changed much since the colouring in days and the folk dance days of the 1960s and 70s. Dance within a national arts curriculum, which consists of dance, drama, media, music and visual arts, is often the least taught of all the art forms in the primary school for a number of reasons. Despite much evidence of the support of the ways that dance supports learning across the curriculum, in particular towards cognition and social and emotional learning, collaborative and participatory learning, and of course physical learning. So dance will be included as one of 5 subjects within the new Australian National Arts Curriculum. Learning in dance and the arts in general is based on collaborative, creative, inquiry-based processes, in contrast to a move away in recent years, particularly in Queensland Australia, away from student-centred, cooperative, inquiry-based learning and towards teacher-centred, direct instruction and explicit teaching. Against the variety of pedagogies and ways that dance is being taught, there are some very specific pedagogical models being used, even mandated in primary schools in Queensland, in North Queensland in particular. So in response to the requirement by the Department of Education in Queensland that all schools institute a school-wide pedagogic framework, many have mandated the use of a particular version of explicit instruction. In this model, teachers use a highly structured and to a degree scripted format for the delivery of all lessons across all year levels and subject areas, and the sequence in many schools always follows the same format. The lesson sequence starts with an orientation, which involves rapid recall routines, warm-ups, which is all about specific content and skills. Prior knowledge is activated through some kind of a tune-in activity, which is all about recall. The lesson is framed very explicitly, the lesson intention, and the success criteria for the lesson are often written and stated or restated by teacher and then students up to 4 times before the lesson even begins. The instruction structure of the lesson always follows the same sequence. I do, which is a teacher exposition, a teacher demonstration of particular content or skill. We do, which is where teachers will support the class to replicate that content or skill, and then you do, where students individually would complete a task. So a fast-paced, familiar introduction, some way of making connection to students, usually prior learning, or this can be extended and is extended by some teachers too, in order to try and make some connection to students' personal experience and knowledge. Explicit statements of expectation and intent, and a familiar and always repeatable sequence for student-teacher action, and a reflection or consolidation of learning, which is referred to as ploughback. It is very much about what did we learn today, and repetition of particular statements or sentences. As opposed to the best practice in dance pedagogy, which is based much more on uncertainty than certainty in some ways, and not individual learning but relational pedagogy, collaborative construction, with the central purpose of creativity, of making dances, support and challenge for students, very clear guidelines as to what to do but very open-ended challenges. Choice and sense of control over that choice is very important, as is fun and intrinsic motivation. So in trying to reconcile those two seemingly different ideas, trying to find a way to fit what I would do in a dance class and what many dance teachers teaching creative dance would do into that same format. So a fast-paced, familiar introduction. So always starting in very similar ways, with milling and movement in the space, exploring different movement ideas, or in a circle, without too much teacher exposition at the beginning. Music is played and dance starts straight away. And this can reinforce particular movement skills, in particular reinforce a key objective of every lesson, which is participation, aiming for enjoyment and aiming for understanding through doing. And the key being always that the lesson starts with movement, not with teacher talk or exposition. A way of making a connection to what we already know can be that familiarity and repetition, but also connecting to students' familiar and favourite genres of music and movement, such as hip-hop or cultural dance forms or sporting experience, but yet extending that a bit more than they would normally experience. Explicit statements of expectations and intent are not something necessarily made in the same way at the same time or at a point in time, but language is always, the language of the teaching is always explicitly made in terms of the language of the dance elements, of the creative process that they were going through. And it's always about that purpose of what we're here for, which is to make dances and to value that process and value our own ideas. Familiar sequence for student-teacher actions, as in the explicit teaching model, I do, we do, you do. In the creative dance, we often go through very similar processes each time, as in movements are generated and explored, then varied and combined in sequences, in groups. Those sequences then further refined using different choreographic devices such as repetition, canon, and then we share, and then we consider, and we reflect. I'm suggesting that those stages, rather than being named by the teacher already, are identified by students and named by them. And so we name our own process, and we can make that visual by having posters on the wall, or by and in a sense own that process. So reflection is not just about what did we learn today. We learned high level, low level, that kind of idea, but it's also about it's thinking about the process. not just reiterating particular words or terms, but allowing open-ended answers to such questions using strategies such as what did I see, what did I think, and what did I wonder. And that doesn't necessarily have to happen just at the end of the lesson, but there can be moments throughout the process where teachers can notice and call attention to particular things that are happening in the process of creating movements. And always going back to that central purpose of dance making, but not at the expense of the intrinsic enjoyment of that. So in making the focus dance making, in making the children's own ideas the focus, they start to learn to not just develop those ideas, but to value them. And I believe that valuing is at the heart of effective dance education. So, moving first, starting with movement to reinforce the key purpose of the lesson, connecting with students' movement cultures and extending them, framing the lesson intent and the focus knowledge and skills, doing that physically, visually, orally, at certain moments and throughout the process, allowing students to identify and name the stages of the creative process, and making reflection a familiar and regular part of all dance making sessions using varied and imaginative strategies and modes.